We are dealing with an extremely sensitive, albeit provocative subject. If this question cannot be answered, then the Christian faith cannot be defended. And if the Christian faith cannot be defended, why even bother proclaiming it? And in my second talk, particularly as we deal with the uniqueness of Christ in the religions of the world, I will make a few preliminary comments at that point, because at that juncture we'll be setting him in contradistinction to any other claim that points its way or that espouses as being one amongst many ways that take us to God or to salvation. My first lecture is entitled, as per assignment, The Uniqueness of Christ in History. The uniqueness of Christ in history. You can come to this academically by looking at the New Testament documents and showing how they have withstood the onslaught of critics or any kind of analysis across the centuries. You could look at this from the perspective of the missionary movements and see how it is many parts of the world have been conquered by the message of Christ, and that too would be quite unique. But I would like to look at this from the very person of Christ and try to set that before you in your thinking. Many years ago, as a teenager growing up in India, I remember listening to a song being narrated by one who was well known in the 1960s, a man by the name of Ed Ames. And of course, raised in India, my ears perked up because of the specific nature of the questions he raised in that song, which was chanted quite in an Eastern fashion with the background of music almost provoking some kind of mysticism. And he said this, it is a rather long song, I'll just quote a couple of verses at this point. He said this: "From the canyons of the mind, we wander on and stumble blind, wade through the often tangled maze of starless nights and sunless days, hoping for some kind of clue, a road to lead us to the truth, but who will answer? Is our hope in walnut shells, wound round the neck with temple bells, or deep within some cloistered walls where hooded figures pray in shawls, or high upon some dusty shelves, or in the stars, or in ourselves? Who will answer?" And the chorus goes, "If the soul is darkened by a fear it cannot name, if the mind is baffled when the rules don't fit the game, who will answer? Who will answer? Who will answer?" Notice the specific nature of the question. He does not long for some abstraction or some dogma. He's not looking for a set of precepts to adhere to or some system that he can give allegiance to. He is personifying the very source of his answer by saying, who has the right to be the answer to the many questions that are plaguing my mind? And indeed, he raises dozens of them as that song unfolds. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, that the name of Christ has been virtually unique and unparalleled in history as the one who claimed in himself to be the locus and the sum and substance of the answer, not just only in what he said or what he taught, but in himself, so that if you remove Christ from the Gospels, there is no gospel message left. He is the central feature of his own message. You have heard these words, I'm sure, but it is most appropriate to use them for a theme such as this, entitled One's Solitary Life. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter's shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things one usually associates with greatness. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the kings that ever reigned have not affected the life of man as much as that one solitary life. I'd like to take the liberty, and please bear with me, to read for you a rather protracted passage. I hesitated to do this, but I think if you stay with the imagination of this writer, you will be as enthralled with it as I was. I lifted it out of a book called The 20th Century Pulpit. And in that is a collation of some of the fine sermons preached in this century. Most of them follow a very straightforward line until you come to a man by the name of Frederick Speakman, who uses his imagination and preaches a whole sermon on an imaginary conversation between Pontius Pilate after he had spelled the death sentence for Christ that he has in turn with one of his servants called Gaius. So here it is in excerpts from a message entitled What Pilate Said One Night. Please listen, it's very, very creative. It suddenly closed in on me, Gaius, the impact of how trapped I was. The proud arm of Rome with all its boast of justice was to be but a dirty dagger in the pudgy hands of the priests. I was waiting in the room for him, Gaius, that I used for court, officially enthroned with cloak and guard when they let him in. Well, Gaius, don't smile at this as you value your jaw. But I've had no peace since the day he walked into my judgment hall. It has been years, Gaius, but these scenes I'll read from the back of my eyelids every night. You've seen Caesar when he was young, inspected the legion. His arrogant manner was childlike compared to the manner of this Nazarene. He didn't have to strut, you see. He walked towards my throne, arms bound with a strident mastery and control that by its very audacity silenced the room for an instant and left me with a trembling and an insane desire to stand up and salute. The clerk began reading the absurd list of charges, the priestly delegation punctuating these with the palm rubbings, the beard strokings, the eye rollings, and the pious gutturals I had learned to ignore. But I more felt it, Gaius, than heard it. I questioned him mechanically. He answered very little, but what he said and the way he said it, it was as if his level gaze had pulled my naked soul right up into my eyes and was probing it there, and a voice kept saying in my ears, "Why, you're on trial, Pilate," and that the man wasn't even listening to the charges. You'd have sworn he'd just come in out of friendly interest to see what was going to happen to me. And the very pressure of his standing there had grown unbearable, Gaius, when a slave rushed in all a tremble, interrupting court, bringing a message from my wife Claudia. She had stabbed at the stylus in that childish way that she has when she is distraught. "Don't judge this amazing man, Pilate," she wrote. "I was haunted in dreams by him this night. Gaius, I tried to free him. From that moment on, I tried, and I'll always think he knew it. I declared him out of my jurisdiction, being a Galilean. But the native King Herod discovered he was born in Judea and sent him right back to me. I then appealed to the crowd that had gathered in the streets, hoping they were his sympathizers. But Caiaphas had stationed agitators to whip up the beasts that cry for blood. And you know how any citizen here loves just after breakfast to cry for another's blood. I had him beaten, Gaius, a thorough barracks room beating. I'm really still not sure why. To appease the crowd, I guess. But do we Romans really need a reason for beatings? That's the code, isn't it, for anything we don't understand? Gaius, it didn't work. The crowd roared like some slavering beast when I brought him back. If only you could have watched him, Gaius. They had thrown some rags of mock purple over his pulped and bleeding shoulders. They had jammed a chaplet of thorns down on his forehead, and it fitted. Gaius, it all fitted. He stood there, watching them from my balcony, flamed from weakness by now, but royal, I tell you, not just pain but pity shining from his eyes. And I kept thinking, this is somehow all monstrous, upside down, that purple Israel, that crown Israel, and somehow these animal noises the crowd is shrieking should be praise. And then Caiaphas played his master stroke on me. He announced there in public that this Jesus claimed a crown and that this was treason to Caesar. And the guards began to glance at one another quickly. And that mob of spineless filth began to shout, "Hail Caesar, hail Caesar." And I knew right then I was beaten. And that's when I gave the order. Gaius, I couldn't look at him. Then I did a childish thing. I called for water. And there on the balcony I washed my hands of that whole affair. Gaius, as they led him away, I did look up. And he turned and looked at me. No smile, no pity. He just glanced at my hands, and I feel the weight of his eyes on them from now on. But you're yawning, Gaius. I've kept you up, and the fact of the matter is you're in need of rest and some holidays. Claudia will be asleep by now. Rows of lighted lamps line her couch. She can't sleep in the dark anymore, not since that afternoon. You see, Gaius, the sun went down when my guards executed him. Yes, that's what I said. I don't know how or what. I only know I was there, and though it was the middle of the day, it turned as black as the tunnels of hell in that miserable city, while I tried to compose Claudia and explain how I'd been trapped, and she railed at me with her dream. She's had that dream ever since, when she sleeps in the dark, some form of it, that there was to be a new Caesar, and that I killed him. Oh, we've been to Egypt to their seers and magicians. We've listened by the hours to the oracles of the musty temples of Greece chattering their inanities. We've called it an oriental curse that we're under, and we've tried to break it 1,000 ways, but there's no breaking it. But you know why I keep going, Gaius? Deeper than the curse is the haunting, driving certainty that he's still somewhere near, that I've unfinished business with him, that now and then as I walk by the lake he's following me. And much as that strikes terror, I wonder if that isn't the only hope. You see, Gaius, if I could walk up to him and this time salute and tell him I know now, whoever he is, he was the only man worth the name in all Judea that day. Tell him I know I wasn't trapped, that I trapped myself. Tell him here's one Roman who really wishes he were Caesar. I believe that would do it. Don't you think so? I believe he'd listen and know that I meant it. And at last I'd see him smile. Yes, quiet tonight, Gaius, isn't it? Not a breeze stirring by the lake. Good night. You'd better run along. No. I think, will you waken my slave outside the door and tell him to bring me a cloak, my heavy one, please. I'll walk by the lake. Yes, it's dark out there, Gaius, but I won't be alone. I guess I never really have been alone. Yes, good night, Gaius. Powerful use of imagination, interwoven with the specific biblical narrative of what really happened when he was handed over. But the line I like there is that his haunting specter still remains, and the writer is writing in the 20th century pulpit, 20 centuries later. Critics have not been able to obliterate him. Contrary views have not been able to smother him. And somehow, within the deepest recesses of the human heart, for millions of people in this world, the name of Jesus Christ still brings the concept of hope and the reality that there must be somebody out there who put my 2 feet on this earth and with a reason to give me some hope. I believe it was James Stewart, the great Scottish divine, who put it in these words in a marvelous passage. He said this about Jesus: he was the meekest and lowliest of all the sons of men, yet he spoke of coming on the clouds of heaven with the glory of God. He was so austere that evil spirits and demons cried out in terror at his coming, yet he was so genial and winsome and approachable that the children loved to play with him and the little ones nestled in his arms. His presence at the innocent gaiety of a village wedding was like the presence of sunshine. No one was half as kind or compassionate to sinners, yet no one ever spoke such red as heart-scorching words against sin. A bruised reed he would not break. His whole life was love. Yet on one occasion he demanded of the Pharisees how they were expected to escape the damnation of hell. He was a dreamer of dreams and a seer of visions, yet for sheer stark realism he has all of our self-styled realists soundly beaten. He was the servant of all, washing the disciples' feet, yet masterfully he strode into the temple, and the money changers and hucksters fell over one another in their mad rush to get away from the fires they saw blazing in his eyes. He saved others, yet at the last himself he did not save. There is nothing in history like the union of contrast which confronts us in the gospel, Sir Stuart. The mystery of Jesus is the mystery of divine personality. What a startling coalescence of contrarieties. So you've listened to the songwriter saying, "Who will answer?" You've heard the anonymous voice crying out about the solitary life. You've heard the imagination haunted that he's still somewhere near. You've heard the theologian utter the fact of this startling blending of contrarieties in our Lord. Now would you listen to a secular voice, the voice of the great historian W.E.H. Lecky in his book, A History of European Morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, published in 1969. Listen to what he says. The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive in its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may be truly said that the simple record of 3 short years of active life has done more to regenerate and soften mankind than all of the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists." End of quote. And the New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce, responding to Lecky's comment, said this: "That is a non-Christian, or at least not distinctively a Christian judgment of one sense in which Jesus is not only a historical figure, but also our eternal contemporary. His influence lives on," says F.F. Bruce. Why is it? What is that uniqueness? How is it that when he ascended into heaven, there were only about 120 people professing allegiance in Palestine that boasted 4 million in population at that time? They were outnumbered 1 to 30,000. What was the uniqueness of that message? May I just define the term in one statement and move to the heart of what I'm going to say to you? The great English professor C.E.M. Joad used to be on the airwaves quite often and used to be asked a lot of questions. And he had a brilliant way of responding to many a question, and he would begin his answer with these words: "It all depends on what you mean by." It all depends on what you mean by. So when we look at the theme, the uniqueness of Christ in history, let's ask the question, it all depends on what you mean by the uniqueness. Does it mean that there is nothing in Christ or his message that you will find anywhere else in some fragmentary form? No. But it does mean that in him there is such a consummate expression of God, and in his message is the totality of the expression of what we need for salvation and life. Listen now, please. So that anything that contradicts it becomes untrue by definition of the fact that he claimed to be the truth. So either he is false or that which contradicts him is false. You understand what I'm saying? There may be hints of truth and ideas that are in other systems, but the consummate expression in Christ is so geared towards truthfulness in an absolute sense, so that anything that contradicts it, ipso facto, becomes false. And that I'll be glad to sustain even in the panel discussion. But as I look at the uniqueness, I want to give you 5 ways in which Jesus is unique. And I'll race through the latter part as I spend more time on the first. First is his eternal perspective. His eternal perspective. The Bible says, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." The son is not born. The child is born. The son is given because the son eternally existed. He prays in his high priestly prayer, "Restore to me the glory, Father, that I had in your presence before this world was made." His eternal perspective and his eternal existence. The Apostle Paul says, "Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon himself the form of a servant," which means he pre-existed the form that was presented in his earthly manifestation. He is the only creature in existence as part of the Godhead, the reason for whose existence is in himself. When I was filling out my doctoral examination at the graduate school that I studied in Chicago, Illinois, I was sent the questionnaire, and the first question said this: "God is perfect, explain." God is perfect, explain. And I turned to my wife and said, the only more difficult question I can think of is to say, define God and give 2 examples. God is perfect. Explain. How do you find an analogy for perfection? And thankfully, the space given to answer the question was yay small. Because I have no doubt whatsoever that the longer the answer, the greater the possibility of heresy. And so I gave that very simple one-liner that I gave to you earlier on. He is the only being in existence, God is, The only being in existence, the reason for whose existence is in himself. Every other creature looks for the reason of its existence outside of itself. We are all contingent, caused, and finite. God alone is infinite, uncaused, and has the reason for his existence in himself. Eternity. But doesn't it blow your mind? Listening to my brother Lou Alberts, talking about going back and back and back till you move to 1 in 10 to the power of minus 46 or 47. Such abstractions we go to and then say, we got to stop here because we cannot pull the veil beyond that within the finitude of our own minds. You know, we lisp about our world. We lisp about the universe because we can never quite come through with a pointed answer. How can we, who are locked into time and space, ever talk in terms transcending time and space? And that's what Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, said, talking about the categories in which we understand reality. We are locked into the categories of time and space. But that's not too bad. You know, we use words where we actually invoke the opposite in order to prove the idea. For example, when we use the word nothing, try to picture nothing. Can you picture nothing? While you're using something to picture nothing, do you hear a sound that's going ooh in the background, defining nothing? It is no thing, so we talk about a thing in order to posit its absence. That's why somebody said to Aristotle, how do you define nothing? He said, it is that which rocks dream about. How do you define eternity? How do you define eternity? When he looks at his questioners and says, before Abraham was, I am. An eternal being. What does that do for us in looking at his uniqueness? The first thing it does is it points to the reality of heaven, which is the heart's deepest longing. It points to the reality of heaven, which is the heart's deepest longing. One of the most bizarre, and if you allow me to use the term, logically silly, and I'm being very kind, logically silly movies ever to come onto the screens was Nikos Kazantzakis' book, put on the screen form, The Last Temptation of Christ. And Nikos Kazantzakis got into problems in his own theology. And he talked about in his book where Jesus is hanging on, I haven't seen the movie. In his book, he talks about how Jesus is hanging on the cross and dying. And when he's paying the penalty for his message, he thinks to himself, you know, I guess I should have been a little kinder and not stuck to the truth in such an exclusive sense. Look what I've given up. I've given up a home that I could have had in Bethany. I could have been married to Mary or Martha and has supposedly dreams and some physical relationships with them. Can you believe that somebody whose home was heaven and glory is regretting that he lost his shack in Bethany? It really doesn't make sense, does it? Who thought it not robbery to be equal with God, the eternal I am, who came into this tiny little world created by his own utterance, as it were, who could talk to us of the glories of heaven. One day I am longing to listen to a whole sermon on heaven. I don't have the capacity to give it the analogies. So I'm borrowing a paragraph from C.S. Lewis, who talks about heaven in one of his writings in his own inimitable way. Listen to it, and listen to it again when you get back in your mind's hearing. Hear it again and again. Listen to what he says about heaven. In speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves, even now I feel a certain shyness. I'm almost committing an indecency. I'm trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you. The secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when in very intimate conversation the mention of heaven becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly longing for it. And we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of the name heaven. And Jesus Christ, in his embodiment, points to the glorious heaven which was his home. How unique for someone to come from the glory of heaven and tell you and me, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. And I have told you earthly things, and you do not understand it. How are you going to understand heavenly things? There is no analogy, yet we cannot hide it in our experience. It keeps on suggesting it. But not only does his reality point to the reality of heaven, please notice now, he fuses every moment of history with meaning. If he is transcending over time, if he is the eternal I am, and always is ever present, our eternal contemporary, in the words of F.F. Bruce, then the fact of the matter is he fuses all of time with significance. Let me put that in perspective for you. When you talk to the existentialist lives in the now, living with a passion for the now. That's the existentialist. Give it all the passion you've got and do it now. The song extrapolates the idea of existentialism. If it feels good, do it. Or the hedonist extrapolates it. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So the athlete gets onto the track and runs the 100 meters, knowing he's got the steroids injected in him, hoping he will not find, nobody will ever find out, because the now is what matters, the glory of the moment. Go out into the night, betray the promises, betray the one to whom you made your promises, indulge in it for the night, because now is all you have. How can it be so wrong when it feels so good? The existentialist lives for the now, and think of the havoc existentialism has created. Jean-Paul Sartre was the existentialist guru in the 60s. His teaching influenced the Ankaleo movement in Cambodia and resulted in the slaughter of millions and millions of people as portrayed in the Killing Fields. Sartrean ethics and Sartrean existentialism provided the worldview for the Ankaleo movement to bring about its slaughter, just as Nietzsche's worldview gave Hitler the liberty to do what he wanted to do. The existentialist lives for the now. The traditionalist looks to the past. The traditionalist looks to the past. Have you ever seen the play Fiddler on the Roof? And you see Tevye coming onto the center stage, and he's giving his little monologue there, talking about how they move from village to village, persecuted. Anatevka's our home. But as they keep moving along, persecuted, tormented, he said, somehow we keep going. Somehow we keep going. And you ask me how? I'll tell you, says he, tradition, 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 and if we did not have our traditions, our existence would be as tenuous as a fiddler on the roof. The Hebrew looks to the past. The existentialist lives for the moment. The utopianist looks to the future. Pie in the sky by and by when I die, a la Marxist-type philosophy. And after 70 years of living a lie in Russia, where millions have been obliterated in the name of utopianism, one of the most dastardly and bloody experiments in history, where their own people were being exterminated in some kind of a utopian, classless society in the future that was going to come. So the existentialist lives for the moment, the traditionalist lives for the past, the utopianist looks to the future. You look at Jesus with his band of few disciples at the table. He takes a piece of bread and he breaks it and he says this, as oft as you shall eat of this bread and drink of this cup, now you do proclaim the Lord's death in the past until he come in the future. He fused every moment of history pregnant with meaning that God gives to it. If I were to ask for one sermon that I could have listened to live, it would be tough, wouldn't it? This great trans-temporalization idea, where he transcends the temporariness of past, present, and future and gives it all meaning. But if he could transport me and say, Ravi, I'd like you to listen to one message live as portrayed in the Old and the New Testaments, which one would you take, Ravi? Oh my. I could think of Elijah on Mount Carmel. I could think of Peter at Pentecost. I could think of Paul on Mars Hill. And of course, that sermon of all sermons, the greatest of all, Sermon on the Mount. But I think as I have weeded through, I don't know if I'm in error, but I've latched on to the one I would love to have listened to live. As those two disciples on the Emmaus Road in Acts chapter 24, in Luke 24, are walking by this time, talking despondently of all that went wrong. We had hoped he would have been the deliverer of Israel. And as they're walking, this third personage joins them. They don't know who he is. And he says to them, what are you boys talking about? And they say to him, are you the only one in Israel who does not know what has happened? Ironically, he was the only one in Israel who did know what had happened. And the Bible says that he unfolded the scriptures and showed them all from beginning of the prophets, all that had to come to pass. And they say how their hearts burned within them, so that as the time came to part, they said, I'll buy you your dinner. Would you sit down and continue talking? And in a masterful stroke of the beauty of the Word of God, it wasn't some great exposition at that moment, but when he simply took that piece of bread and broke it, their eyes were suddenly opened, and they saw the entire panorama of history through the eyes of the Eternal One. In my office in Atlanta, I have these words penned in, and someone has put it on a parchment, on a frame, and it says this: Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive, and he compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way he encounters the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. He continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. The American football coach Lou Little, using the word football the way they use it in America, for the sport they play there. He was a college football coach, one of the greatest. Talks of the time that one of the young men on his team was an outstanding young man in character, but never quite made it to the front, to the top spot. He was always a backup, a bench warmer as they called him, a great young man. And Lou Little says, many times I'd see this young man walking his father through the college property. His father's arm would be in his son's, and the son would be talking to him about the buildings or explaining some piece of architecture or painting. And he said they seemed to be so close as dad and son that I never quite got to the point of introducing myself and breaking up that closeness. Until one day I got a call from his mother saying, Coach Little, my son admires you an awful lot. He feels very close to you. His father has just died a few moments ago. Will you please help my boy get his plane ticket, put him on the plane, and send him back for the funeral? Coach Little did that. On the day of the game, the young man flew back. He said, Coach, I want you to do something. Would you please do this for me? I want to play the game tonight. I know I'm not the first stringer, but I want to play the game tonight. Coach said, I can't let you. He said, but I tell you what, if you play better than the man whom you're replacing, I'll leave you in there. If you're not playing as well, I'll have to take you out. He said, that's fine. He went and played, and by far was the star of the game, gave it an effort and a half. And when it was over, the coach put his arm around this young man's shoulder and said, I know what's happened. You played that for your dad, didn't you? He said, yes, Coach, but I want to tell you something. My dad was born blind. And this was the first time he was going to watch me play. I grant it, there's a sentimentality there. I grant it, you won't base a doctrine on that story because it has a romantic, imaginative touch to it. Let me tell you something. He, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, and made himself of no reputation and came and dwelt among us. There was nothing romantic about him when he talked about heaven. He knew its stark reality, albeit fused with the glory of the romantic love and the beauty of being in the presence of God himself. His eternal perspective. Secondly, his internal imperative. His internal imperative. He did not come to set up a political power that would rule and constrain from without. He came to touch the hearts of men and women that would bring the imperative from within. And what a world of difference that is. Jesus did not come to set up some political structure in this world. Politics swings from one end to the other, and political ideas almost become like that drunken man moving from one wall to the other, knocking itself senseless with every hit. And almost correct, maybe ideologically, was the Hegelian doctrine of how each idea which forms a thesis sooner or later spawns its antithesis, and somewhere they meet in the future to form a synthesis. But moving from one wall to the other, knocking itself senseless is what I'm talking about. He did not come to change humanity by establishing an earthly government or some political strategy. You see, politics inevitably moves towards power. Politics inevitably moves towards power. And Lord Acton has rightly said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He came instead to touch your heart and to touch mine. And that's why Napoleon said it. Napoleon said it well. He said, Alexander's kingdom and my kingdom will ultimately come to naught, but Jesus' kingdom is indestructible, because ours was dominated by power and force. He's dominated the lives of people with the power of love. He changes us from within, that divine, that internal imperative that we talk about. C.S. Lewis describes his conversion in these words: I had always wanted above all things not to be interfered with. I had wanted to call my soul my own. I had been far more anxious to avoid suffering than to achieve delight. I had always aimed at limited liabilities. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, relenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. I did not see then what I see now, the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet, but who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who's brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape? The words compelle intrare, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them. But properly understood, they plumb the depths of divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation. And if you keep reading on in his book, Surprised by Joy, he says there was no pressure as he rode in that bus that day, just that gentle tug, this is right, this is the right way to go. You know, Jesus could have yielded to political temptation. When the devil said to him, turn these stones into bread and they'll follow you, he said no. The marvelous thing about him was he did not want to draw people by feeding some earthly appetite of theirs. Every leader sooner or later finds out that self-centered appetites are insatiable. You can never satisfy the one who wants more and more and more bread and the things of this world. He works from within. Billy Graham tells the story of a man who had lost his life in alcoholism, a medical doctor who marvelously came to know Christ. And one day when he was sitting in his doctor's office, a friend came to him and he said, let me ask you something. Please tell me. I'm trying to explain what's happened to you, trying to explain it away as a fellow medical colleague of yours. Tell me something. We're all trying to understand you. What's happened? Is it a psychological uplift you've received? What is this? And you can answer it by telling me this. I know how you were hooked on the habit of liquor. Tell me, if you were to come back to your home, to your office some afternoon after a miserable day of all that's gone wrong, and you shut that door, and you know you're alone, and nobody is there with you, are you telling me with that finest bottle tucked away behind your medical journals, if you had one, you're not going to reach out and take that drink once more, even though it'll bring back all the memories of the past? and your enslavement. Are you telling me, with a miserable day, locked behind closed doors, nobody with you, you're alone, you wouldn't yield to that? He said, no, every contingency you've given can at some time properly happen, except one. Since I have come to know Christ, I have found out I am never, ever alone. I came to know Christ on a bed of suicide as a teenager in Delhi. All the religiosity from without had done nothing from me. All the power my dad wielded in the political arena had only alienated me because I was no longer important to him. I say that kindly because God marvelously changed his life down the line too. But I just want you to know this, how he entered a hospital room and touched the heart of a young man with the gentleness and a wideness of his mercy, just as he's done for many of you here. You know what it is not to be compelled from without, but to have that internal imperative from within. Will Durant says this in his book, there is no greater drama in history, in the historical record, than the sight of a few Christians scorned or in some way beaten by a succession of emperors, bearing all trials with a fierce tenacity, multiplying quietly, building order while their enemies generated chaos, fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope, and at last defeating the strongest state that history had ever known. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, and Christ had won. Durant says this, Christ had won by touching the hearts of his people. So there it is. You have the eternal perspective, the internal imperative, thirdly and quickly, his personal directive. As vast as this world is, and as vast as this world was, Christ had time for the individual. His message is personal in this cosmic scheme of things. In this cosmic scheme of things, I say to you, how marvelous to know that he has time for you and me personally. We heard statistics earlier on, billions and billions and billions. Numbers that stagger the imagination. What is there in man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you visited him? For when I see the heavens and the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have made, what is there in man that you're mindful of him? But yet as he walked through that village with the masses, he got talking to this woman who had been married 5 times, rejected by many people evidently, who was immoral in the sight of society. And in that society, being a woman was even more rejected in her very gender. Her ethnicity was against her. She bore that horrible term called a Samaritan, which was a scourge in that time, despised by the so-called pure. There she was, morally, in her femininity, in her ethnicity, all of those rejections. And she runs back to her village and she says this, you'll never believe what happened. I have met somebody who knew everything about me and didn't hang me up by a cord, is what she's trying to say. I have to think of a comment made by a great professor of one of the major religions in the world. The professor is teaching in California. When a death sentence was passed on a man for writing a book against this, that seemed to mock that religion, a very foolish thing to have done, gets nobody anywhere. But you know this story, how the death sentence was passed on him by the Ayatollah. And it was interesting to listen to a newspaperman or Ted Koppel, the Nightline, say to this professor, tell me, how can you pass the death sentence on an individual like that? All right, he's been blasphemous, he's been wrong, but you really want to take such vengeance into your own hands? And the man looked at Mr. Koppel and said, sir, in what I believe and what we believe, I don't know if he's representing all of them, but this is what he said. The individual is dispensable. It is the system that has to survive. The message has to go on. The individual is dispensable. I couldn't help but think of the parable of Jesus, where the shepherd left the 99 going looking for the one, because the individual was not dispensable. The story is told of an American politician who was talking about the victimization of some people, a minority class. And one day a young teenager from the minority class came to him because he knew this man was giving speeches creating bumper stickers, writing placards on the needs and the rights of the minority. And so this young teenager went and met up with the politician's secretary at the door and said, "Can I go and see him for just 1 minute, please? I need 1 moment of his time. He's delivering a great speech today." And the secretary went to his boss and he says, "There's a teenager, he wants just a few moments of your time." The politician said, "Tell him I have got so involved in his cause, I don't have time for the individual anymore." And the secretary paused and said, "That is incredible, sir. Even God has not come to that stage yet." Isn't it nice to know in the macrocosmic entities of this world, he has the particularity of your need in mind too, and you can come to him by prayer and call him Holy Father, and he hears you and he hears me. His personal directive. So you've got first his eternal perspective, second his internal imperative, thirdly his personal directive, fourthly and quickly his inspirational incentive. His inspirational incentive. How he has been the focal point of musicians and artists for centuries, virtually unparalleled. Virtually unparalleled. That a man by the name of George Frederick Handel, in 24 days, can pen that great masterpiece called The Messiah, so that as he's writing with almost a sense of inspiration, he says, "It is as if I saw the heavens open and God present himself, and the tears are running down his face, and he's writing the marvelous words and the music to the Hallelujah chorus." And as he talks about it, he says, "I felt as though I had a divine visitation." And after the first performance, one of the nobility looks at him and says, "Mr. Handel," he said, "the people really enjoyed what you have done." And he said, "I'm disappointed. I was hoping they would be better people for what they had just heard." How God has inspired the songwriter, from the Bachs, from the Steiners, from the Mendelssohns to the Handels, and the Wesleys and the Watts, and the marvelous hymn writers, and the converted slave trader John Newton. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And the young man who went insane and spent so much time in an insane asylum, coming under the influence of John Newton and coming to know the touch of God upon his own life, William Cooper, who co-authored a book of hymns with John Newton, and William Cooper, coming in and out of an insane asylum, writes, "God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his works in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain." Think of what Christian music has done across the centuries. Unparalleled, unparalleled in so many languages of the world. You know what it does? It does two things. It has not only bridged the imagination with eternal values, but it binds our emotion and stirs affection across linguistic and cultural barriers. Here are the two things broken down. First, it knits your heart with your fellow believer in many parts of the world where you don't even understand the language. One great evangelist, whom I shall leave unnamed, had one of his team members years ago walking on the streets of Romania. And as he was walking by, looking at this desolate country as a visitor, incognito, as he was walking, I think somewhere in the streets of Bucharest, he heard a man walk by on a cold wintry day whistling a tune. And it wasn't a common tune. It was from this hymn, "The great physician now is here, the sympathizing Jesus." And this man paused, looked at him, walked by him, and started to whistle the tune along with him. They looked at each other, couldn't speak. Then the Romanian points to the heavens and then touches his heart. This American points to the heaven and touches his heart too, and they both lock each other in embrace. The gift of music transcending mere verbiage. The uniqueness that God has given in this inspirational incentive. But not only that, it talks about the joy that comes into our hearts at the loneliest times in our lives. I recall 3 years ago being in China, in the town of Shanghai, visiting that aged evangelist Wang Mingdao, who died very recently. Wang Mingdao hit the church news many years ago because when Mao Zedong took over, he put Wang Mingdao into prison in Beijing, and he was suffering greatly. He suffered so much that Wang Mingdao denied the name of his Lord, and so Mao Zedong released him. But after he was released, he was so gnawed by sadness and by remorse. He walked through the streets of Beijing shouting at the top of his voice, my name is Peter, I've denied my Lord. My name is Peter, I've denied my Lord. Mao Zedong had him arrested again and put him behind prison bars for over 20 years. After he'd been released, I had the privilege of being with him in his tiny little room in Shanghai. Along with another evangelist, we were there. And as we sat there, this man with his head thrown back, hands gnarled, mouth unable to close, his tongue was not easily controllable due to some deformity he had developed over the years. His wife completely blind, and some young men sitting at their feet listening to our conversation. And all of a sudden, before I left, he said, would you mind if I sing for you the song that I sang in prison every day? So that first the guards hated it, then they began to tolerate it, then they loved it and were disappointed if I didn't sing it. And he sang all the way, my Savior leads me, what have I to ask beside? Can I doubt his tender mercy, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by grace with him to dwell. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. I can never listen to that song again without listening to it in a Chinese accent. The inspirational incentive. I don't have time to tie this thought together with a marvelous quote from G.K. Chesterton, who talks about why Jesus never laughed on earth that is recorded. And he says, I think there was a certain shyness. And he says one of the things that he maybe hid from us was his mirth, an eternal mirth that there is no analogy for in her earth again. He wept. He was sad at times, but the laughter has no parallel. The laughter of heaven has nothing like that on earth alone. But we've seen his eternal perspective, his internal imperative, his personal directive, his inspirational incentive, and lastly, his incarnational distinctive. His incarnational distinctive as the Word became flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is the embodiment, God becoming flesh, giving this body dignity, so that I don't have to be like a Gnostic thinking matter is evil, nor do I be like the hedonist who indulges without restraint. Now I know this body is the temple of the living God. And consummating in that monogamous heterosexual union, the marvelous gift that God has given to us in marriage, the consummate physical expression that points to a greater spiritual reality, for we now are his bride, and he is the bridegroom, but God in the flesh giving the body a dignity, so that when we are raised again, it is a glorified body, and while he himself takes that body, it is not essentially evil. He shows us how to live in this mortal frame. Victor Hugo said, the world was made for the body for the soul, and the soul for God. I had requested from Dennis House if I had 5 extra minutes. I've taken it, so I close now with this quote and end it. We've talked about the uniqueness of Christ in history, his eternal perspective, his internal imperative, his personal directive, his inspirational incentive, and his incarnational distinctive. It is my favorite quote, and most in order to use it here. It is so unique. It comes from the mouth of Malcolm Muggeridge, who had traversed the world as a peripatetic journalist interviewing the best and the worst of them. He says this, we look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has spoken of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. I look back upon my own fellow countrymen, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made the mighty shall make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed-cracked Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown saying he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I've met a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as a wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius, more enlightened than Ashoka. I have seen America wealthier and in terms of military weaponry more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest. All in one lifetime, all gone. Gone with the wind. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America haunted by fears of running out of those precious fluids that keeps our motorways roaring and the smog settling, with troubled memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam and the victories of the Don Quixotes of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime, gone. So behind the debris of these self-styled solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists stands the gigantic figure of one person, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom mankind might still have hope, the person of Jesus Christ. Yes, there were many who tried to be, many men who tried to be God, but only the one true God who was willing to become man. And in his uniqueness, he gives us the heavenly perspective on history. May God bless you. Thank you for your patience. Task. This is not an easy subject that has been assigned to me. Although my field of study is philosophy of religion, and I do an awful lot of lecturing on the theme around the world, I also want to be very, very sensitive, because it is easy to bring offense when you're dealing with something like this. It is easy to trample underfoot truths and ideas that others greatly treasure. And none of us wants that done to that which we believe, and why end up doing it to what someone else believes? That is the positive and the noble aesthetic side of it. But the counterpoint is, how does one really ever come to grips with truth if it is not put in contrast with conflicting truth claims? What do you do when there are conflicting truth claims? And therefore, what I would like to do, ladies and gentlemen, as I introduce my message, is first of all set the foundation for the laws of logic, that 2 contradictory statements both cannot be true. Only one of them may be true. Both of them may be false, but both of them cannot be true unless the laws of logic do not apply to reality. And if one denies that the laws of logic apply to reality, how do we ever even converse? The moment you open your mouth, you assume a meaningful statement is about to be made. And if somebody challenges that statement, how do you anchor anything in reality? I mean, a scientist like Dr. Alberts cannot possibly take 2 conflicting measurements for the same thing. A pilot listening to the guidance that is coming from the tower is not going to take 2 opposite numbers both to be true, unless in one sense one of them becomes qualified, asserting something else. So what I'd like to do is first establish the laws of logic. Some of you may be familiar with that argument, but many of you may not be, and so I'd like for you to hear that. But the second thing I want to do is deal with the major attacks that Christianity has had to face, particularly from Islam. So I'm not going to deal with Islamic doctrine. I'm not going to try and debunk any of their doctrines. I'm just going to try to present to you what is the problem the Christian faces in trying to communicate somebody who holds to a Muslim worldview. What is the difficulty the Christian faces in communication? And I can assure you, I will do that as sensitively as I can for at least a couple of reasons. Not that it is, first of all, the proper thing to do, but I have the privilege by many Islamic governments around the world to be in their country and lecture and dialogue. And this year is no exception. I will be in 3 Muslim countries speaking, and they are kind enough to host me. I want to be respectful of the fact that they are willing to give us a hearing. And the other thing is, I have some of the greatest respect for 1 or 2 fine Islamic scholars around the world today, particularly one by the name of Jamal Badawi in the United States, who is a very fine gentleman. and makes dialogue much easier as we talk. I will highlight the tensions that I have presented in such situations, and they realize it, but it is important to know that. Having set the logical base, then having set the greatest tension in a dialogue with the other monotheistic worldview that is principally trying to in some way undermine the Christian faith, if not explicitly, implicitly, then I will move on to the uniqueness of Christ in world religions. I won't have time to deal with the pantheistic worldviews that other Eastern beliefs adhere to. If those of you who are interested, we have a lot of material where you analyze pantheism again within itself rather than just in a comparison of the two. J.N.D. Anderson, who now writes under the name of Norman Anderson, has written very heavily in the field of comparative religions. One of the finest books he has written is called Christianity and World Religions. Sir Norman Anderson, operating out of England, is a scholar still writing, although in his senior years, very much an authority in history, philosophy, and law. And in his book, Christianity and World Religions, he gives three major distinctives that come under the category of a unique proclamation, a unique salvation, and a unique disclosure. I greatly encourage you to get a hold of that. It is very succinct and very well done by a fine contemporary thinker. Here is the law of logic as it applies to reality. I remember speaking, please bear with me for those of you who are familiar with this illustration, but it is the most incisive one that I can give to you. I remember speaking in one of the United States western cities when one of the professors was attending the lectureship and asked me to speak against an Eastern religion, which I said I would not do. He said, I'm an American, I belong to that other Eastern religion, let's just call it X. And he said, and I have taught this X religion in my lectures and so on. I want you to speak on the subject why you do not subscribe to the dogma of religion X. And my students will take you apart after your lecture. I said, no, I really don't want to do that. I said, I've learned when you throw mud at others, not only do you get your hands dirty, but you also lose a lot of ground. And he accepted that. I said, but I will tell you why I am a Christian. I will speak on that subject. At the end of the talk, he was quite vociferous in his denunciation of what I'd said, and he basically took me to task at the front of the lecture room, attacking the fact that I didn't understand logic and so on. I said, look, we're not going to get anywhere. Let's go out for lunch. You pay, and I'll pray, and we'll get together. So we got together for lunch, and he brought a professor of psychology with him, and the psychologist and I finished our lunch while the philosopher hadn't even started his. His food had become congealed in front of him. And he had taken off these paper placemats of all the tables to draw out his argument. And basically what he was trying to say was this, that there are two kinds of logic. Actually, he was wrong, there are more. But he said there are two kinds of logic. One is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction means if something is true, the opposite of it is false. If something is true, the opposite of it is false. It is called an either-or logic. If I say to you, for example, there is a red car parked immediately outside the steps there, if that statement is true, the opposite of it is false. I am not at the same time saying that red car is not parked out there. It is either true or false. I've just given you a simple illustration. If it is A, then it is not non-A at the same time. You basically establish the either-or dogma. And he says, Ravi, that is the law of non-contradiction, that is either-or, that is a Western way of thinking. Westerners think either-or. I said, I disagree with the last statement. Why don't you rub it off? He wouldn't do it. So then he moved to the Eastern way of thinking. He said, in the East, you do both and. It is a dialectic. You don't say either this or that. You say both this and that. Karl Marx used the dialectical system. It was not either the employer or the employee. You put them together and you find a classless society. Both employer and employee join together in a classless society. Funny thing, they never show you one, but they talk about it. That there is a both and dogma in the dialectic, two poles of an argument there. And he says, you see, Ravi, he said, the dialectical system is Eastern. The dialectical system is Eastern. And I said, why don't you cross out that last line? Because I don't agree with you, but he refused to cross it out. What he was trying to say was this. I had talked about the many contradictions in certain pantheistic worldviews, very strong contradictions. And he said, you see, Ravi, if you took the dialectical system to be true. Anytime you came into a contradiction, you won't be puzzled by it. You'll say, this is the way they think. They make opposite statements, and both of them are right. So if you ask one follower of religion X, is God personal? He says yes. You ask a second follower of religion X, is God personal? And he says no. You go to the third person and say, which of these two is right? And he says, both of them. He says that's an Eastern way of thinking. So you've got the either or, which is Western, the both and, which is Eastern. And he was waxing eloquent on this, going on and on and on. Finally, I said, can I say something to you, sir? He said yes, and he picked up his knife and fork and started to cut into his first morsel of food. And as he was cutting into the morsel of food, I said, here's what you've told me. There is an either or, which is Western. There is a both and, which is Eastern, and you want me to study religion X, right? Now, here's my question to you, doctor. Are you telling me when I'm studying religion X, I either use the both and system or nothing else? Is that right? That I either use the both and system or nothing else? Is that right? Do you know what he did? He put his knife and fork down, and with a very nervous expression, I wish I had the cameras there to film it, he says to me, the either or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, yes, in fact, I've got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. Do you see what he was doing? He was using the either or with which to prove the both and. He was telling me I either use this system or nothing else. And he was staggered to realize that he used it every day. So it's got nothing to do whether it's Western or whether it's Eastern. It's got everything to do with that which best reflects reality. And when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man comes unto the Father but by me, it is a most reasonable statement. The question is it true? It is a most reasonable statement because truth, by definition, is exclusive. The moment you affirm something, you exclude anything that challenges that. And the way you prove the law of non-contradiction is that by just talking, and if anyone else stands up and challenges you against it, by challenging you, they are proving you right. That it is either what you're saying or what they're saying. Now, the Easterner understands this malady. That's why the Easterner says, when the mouth opens, all are fools. But the problem is his mouth opens to tell us that. Or as one of the famous mystics said, he who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. Well, did he speak? And if he spoke, then he does not know. And if he does not know, does it really matter if he spoke? The law of non-contradiction must apply to reality. If you deny the law of non-contradiction, you may as well talk about a one-ended stick. It cannot even be pictured, leave alone stated. Because the opposite poles are very much in your mind of an either or there. Now, it is therefore more logically possible that all the religions in the world are wrong, but it is not logically sensible to say that all the religions in the world are right. It just can't be. The pantheist affirms something very different to the theist. The theist affirms something very different to the atheist. And you go on and right down the line, and you find out that two contradictory systems cannot really be true. Now, this is really the fundamental problem that I find as a Christian lecturer and a philosopher dealing with the Islamic worldview. I find at least 4 basic challenges that they give to us that are impossible to meet, that are absolutely impossible to meet, because in the process of them stating those arguments against Christianity, those arguments end up, in a sense, self-destructing. And by the way, I have debated some of the best of them in the other part of the world. They have never really responded to this challenge. I'm not talking about their fundamental doctrines. I'm talking about their philosophical assumptions. The first problem I find is this. You see, if their prophet is espoused by them, which he is, as being a prophet to the world, he is espoused by them as being a prophet to the world, not just to Arabia or to the Middle East. He is the last and the final prophet to the world, and he, they say, performed no miracles because there was no need for it. The Quran is in itself a miracle. But here's the problem. The Quran is in Arabic. And I am not given the privilege of even challenging its word usage. Please remember, this is vital. Because you see, when you take words or changes in the Quran, which they will tell you have never been made, although some great scholars like Ali Dashti from Iran challenge that assumption, the fact of the matter is, unless I know the language, I cannot perceive the miracle. Unless I know the language, I cannot perceive the miracle, which basically means there are millions of people in the world to whom the language in which their scriptures are written will ever remain completely foreign, and the miracle becomes purely one affirmed by those who know the language. It can never be tested in your experience, because the English translations, they tell you, and any other translations are not accurate except the original as given in the original language. How does one deal with a miracle that is not recognizable by the masses in society? That presents the first problem. There is a second problem it presents to me. They abolish our authority, which is the scriptures, without an original with which to condemn ours. So we are told by the scholars representing that view that the Bible we have is not the original Bible given. It is a corrupt Bible, that there are many contradictions in it. It is not an accurate reflection of Jesus Christ. For example, they espouse that Jesus never really died on the cross, and therefore the resurrection was purely a fabrication of later collectors of the ideas. Now, let me ask you this. How does one ever know something to be truthful if there is not a unit by which to measure it? There is no point of reference. If I were presented with an original that clearly debunks what we do have, then the dialogue can begin. But if I'm told what I have is error-prone and wrong on the basis of something they have never shown to me, how does one begin to dialogue? Do you see the problem? It is like talking about the moon being so far away from here, but saying we have no way to measure it, but take my word for it, that's how far it is. It has destroyed our original authority and told us we have no authority now. Therefore, the Bible has been taken away from the Christian, and the Christian has got nothing left to defend because he does not have the original Bible. How does one begin a dialogue with that? Thirdly, and very importantly here now, as you know, the Quran was written about 6 centuries after Jesus Christ. Now, their problem was that what has happened is that the original absolute which was given has been lost. Now remember, their belief in a sovereign God, a very sovereign God, but the original revelation as given in what they call the Injil, the Gospels, has been lost. Now 600 years later comes the latest and the greatest and the final revelation, which means B succeeds A 600 years later, and B overrules A because A is lost. And what we believe is now false, therefore B has to overrule A. Question. If that is the way an absolute can be overruled, what is to keep C from coming in 6 centuries from now and overruling B? And after all, isn't that what Joseph Smith really did in the founding of Mormonism? That's precisely what Joseph Smith did. He said all of the religions of the world coming centuries after Islam, for example, Mormonism said, all of the revelations have all become corrupt. Now he has come out with the last and the greatest and so on. So absolutes keep overruling absolutes without any point of reference for the previous absolute. It is philosophically unarguable. You cannot talk about it because there is no more a possibility of discussing absolutes. That is number 3. And number 4, this is a sad one, but it is true. Many scholars of that school of thought reserve the right to impugn and debunk truths that we hold about our Lord. But you cannot do the same with the names that are precious to them. You follow what I'm saying? I can be told in the Quran that Jesus never died, which is what it is said out there. And I can have people look at me and say that this is a blasphemy. Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God, which is completely wrong. He does claim to be the Son of God. There are all kinds of concepts that are treasured truths. The very cross and the empty tomb are so precious to us, and the very person of Christ so precious to us. How does one dialogue with 2 people talking while A reserves the right to impugn what B is defending, but B is not given the same privilege of closely scrutinizing what A is defending. These points of tension make meaningful dialogue very, very difficult, with all respect for the scholarship. That's all I want to say to you about that system, and I believe it is a hatpin in the heart of that system because it philosophically does not really cohere in its fundamental assumptions. I have several others, and I've got hours of material on that, but I just leave that with you. So we've established the law of non-contradiction, that the laws of logic apply to reality. We've established the fact that we have been attacked by one principal other philosophy around, or belief system around today, but that belief system self-destructs in its philosophical assumptions. So let me take the person of Christ and his uniqueness in the religions of the world. And I'm sure between my brother Alberts and brother Cassidy, as they have so beautifully portrayed some of the fundamental doctrines, there will obviously be some overlap here, but if you bear long enough, you will see how marvelously the applications move from one mind to another, each with its distinctive strength. First is Jesus' description on the reality of human nature. The reality of human nature. He knew what was in the hearts of men and women. Many times as he talked to his antagonists, or as he talked to those who had bitter questions about him or against him, when he replied to them, the Bible says he knew what was in the heart of man. And he faced the temptations that Satan cast his way also without sinning himself. But he showed us the reality of the human nature with which we all live. I have not gone into a detailed study of this hellish act that has taken place recently, of that little 2-year-old child so brutalized and savagely murdered by 2 10-year-olds. In England, how do you explain that? Where does all this come from? Where does one come upon a Hitler or a Stalin? Or where does one come upon racism and the bitter specter of it in many, many parts of the globe, not just here or in the United States, but in even the Far East or even in the land of my birth, where there is such tension between different colors of people in a land that talks about equality so much? How does one explain it? Are we really going to change the human heart by better education? Are you really going to take away the lust in my heart by writing some great book on physiological theories? Are you going to take pride away from me by just telling me that somebody else had a downfall because of his or her pride? Are you going to take greed away from me just by telling me, look what happened to Donald Trump, he messed his whole thing up, so you shouldn't be coveting all this riches? How does one change the longings of the human heart? Malcolm Muggeridge put it best when he said this. He said, the doctrine of depravity is the most debated doctrine in society, but it is also the most empirically verifiable. You cannot deny it. Let me give you a classic illustration that comes to me from the pen of Muggeridge himself. And when he began to realize what kind of a person he was, as you know, he was editor of Punch magazine. I had the privilege of being with Malcolm Muggeridge a few months before he died, one of the great thrills of my life in his beautiful home in Sussex, England, as we walked his gardens and talked about all that he had learned in these 80-some years of his. And Muggeridge said he was teaching journalism in India, and how all of a sudden, early one morning, he went out to swim in the river nearby, and when he went out to swim in that sunrise, there was nobody there, but way out in the distance, he saw an Indian woman coming to have a bath. And Muggeridge, though a married man, decided this was going to be the moment of his crossing the line and betraying his trust to his wife, Kitty. And he struggled within the cauldron of his own unholy passions, almost in that Augustinian sense, one pulling him in one side and another in the other. But the more he riveted his attention upon her, he thought this was be it. After all, here was a white, Western, successful man. There was a poor Indian village woman. He would proposition her and she would respond. So he swims towards her and he describes the passion within his heart, raging like a swirling river within him. Even though something within him said, don't. He said, I swam harder to get away from that which was restricting me. And as I came closer and closer and emerged from the water and shook the water off my eyes, I was face to face with this Indian woman until I suddenly realized as I opened my eyes, I was looking into the face of a leper. And as she lifted her hands up, no fingers, the eyelashes and the eyebrows all gone, and the nose just eroded away with that dreadful nerve disease. And as he stared at her, looking almost animal-like at him with her eyes sunken in a state of shock, "What are you doing so near a leper, sir?" He said, "I was on the verge of saying to her, 'What a lecherous woman,' when it hit me between the heart, as hard as it could be hit. What a lecherous heart I had." Just a few days ago, I was in a city that I shall leave unnamed, on a very high floor, the top floor of a building, by one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, extraordinarily wealthy. I will not name the city or the company, although I don't think there'd be any betrayal, but let me just keep it that way. And he and I talked for about 2 hours after a talk that I had just given. And he kept talking about the fact that he doesn't want to believe in God, but he does want to believe that some things is right or wrong. And he said, "I see this right or wrong around me every day. I see the flaunting of ethics. I see the immorality." And as we dialogued, the Christian businessman who'd taken me to talk to him suddenly broke in with a brilliant question. He said to this businessman, he said, "You know that I love you, and so I think I have the right to ask you this." He said, "You've been telling Ravi all along how much you despise the immorality that you see around you." And he called him by name and leaned forward and said, "What do you do with the evil that you see in your own heart?" And I was so glad the man interrupted. He said, "I don't know. I guess I would have to say that whenever I express it, it is a victimless act." I said, "Do you recall, sir, when Prime Minister Konoye of Japan died or committed suicide, he left on his night table the book by Oscar Wilde, De Profundis, and he had underlined one line there which said this: 'As terrible as it was what I had done to others, nothing was as terrible as what I had done to myself.' Evil is not victimless. It victimizes the very person. Like one of the judges at the Nuremberg trial said, 'After I took the life of the first innocent man, I was no longer the same person.' What do you do with this? How are we going to change it? How are we going to change it? I have a beautiful story that I tell. I love it so much. Nothing expresses it better. Of these two very wealthy men who were rather immoral people. Both of them were pretty bad in their behavior, and they were notorious in the city. And all of a sudden, one of them suddenly died. And so the surviving brother went to the local preacher and said, "Would you preach at my brother's funeral?" And the preacher didn't want to do it, but the surviving brother said, "I'll give you a fat lot of money," and named the amount. He said, "I'd like you to preach at the funeral, and only do me one favor. In the middle of your eulogy of my brother," he assumed there was going to be a eulogy, he said, "in the middle of the eulogy of my brother, will you just refer to him as a saint? And I'll pay you what I said I would." The preacher was a good business manager and decided to take on the challenge. And the day of the funeral came, and he waxed eloquent, and he said, "The man you see lying here in the coffin is a murderer, he's a liar, he's an adulterer, he's duplicitous, he has done every dirty, rotten, stinking thing your mind can think of, but compared to his brother, he's a saint." Who are you compared to someone else? You may be a saint compared to someone else, but the Bible describes sin not only in transgression, it describes sin as coming short of the glory of God. Coming short of the glory of God. And I want you to know that the powerful treatment that Jesus gives to this whole issue of the nature of man and sin is felt more and more in our world today than ever before. Just think about it. The 20th century has been the most bloodletting century in history. Think about that, and we are supposedly in the age of progress. I think of what's going on in Yugoslavia. I think of the hurts around the world. I think of the slaughter of infants in all the rights that we now claim to ourselves. I think of the tragedy, so much so that one recent appointee of President Clinton, when he was being quizzed by the Senate Committee for his confirmation, described the world as 1,000 points of darkness. 1,000 points of darkness. One of the men I had as a hero in my teenage years was the great tennis player Arthur Ashe, who just died of AIDS very recently in the last 2 to 3 weeks. He was a gentleman on and off the court, and through a blood transfusion contracted that disease and died. I did not hear it directly, but my sister quoted it to me, and I was using it at Harvard University some time ago speaking, and all of the students nodded their head when I said it, so I assume it is exactly as it was communicated to me. He said, I have lived with a lot of pain in my life, including AIDS, having gained it innocently. He said, but nothing has hurt me more, please hear me, than the pain that I have felt for the rejection of my race. Think of that. A man dying of AIDS, saying to you, not to me, you and me, to the world, nothing has hurt me more than the pain I have experienced before the rejection of my race. The lips of dying men seldom lie. How are we going to change this? How are we going to change this? Please believe me, it will never happen just because we institute new laws in any land. Unless we understand the nature of the human heart and the unique answer that Christ gives, we will never be able to change it. Listen to Hobart Maurer, one-time president of the American Psychological Association, who ultimately ended up committing suicide. And the American psychologist in 1960 said this, for several decades, we psychologists looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from it as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free in this sense, that is to have the excuse of being sick rather than sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living mean? The reality of human nature is best portrayed in the teaching of Christ. And even secular atheistic psychologists, as Hobart Maurer was, said something has been lost when we lost the understanding of the dogma of sin. And he said when he wrote that article, he received more letters to him than any other thing he'd ever written. He was trying to recover a concept of sin. The reality of human nature. Secondly is the spirituality of genuine worship, the uniqueness of Christ, the spirituality of genuine worship. Jesus rescued us from the tyranny of limiting worship to geographical boundaries and buildings. You hear that? He rescued us from the tyranny of restricting worship to geographical locations and buildings. Do you know that entire tragedy, which India Today captured under 2 words on the front page of their cover of the India Today magazine? India's shame is what it called it, the destruction of the mosque by some fanatics, because they said it was holy ground and belonged to one of the gods of their mythology and so on. How tragic to inflict things like this while men and women were killed, children were killed, because worship was restricted to a certain geographical location. When you go to the Old Testament, you see something fascinating happening. God is describing the dimensions of the temple. And as he is describing the dimensions and how the tabernacle for Moses, he says this, make it so high and no higher, so wide and no wider, so long and no longer. Use such and such a material, use such and such a person, use such and such colors. There were very specific directives. There was no equivocation on it. This is the way it had to be. And Moses complied. But you see, in our day, we have church buildings. We don't have tabernacles or temples of old where specific directions were given. Why is that? Because as Christ taught us, we don't go to the temple anymore. We take the temple with us. So when 300 people gather together for worship, it is not 300 people going into a sanctuary, but 300 sanctuaries gathering at a point so that we could be rescued from the tyranny of a locational worship. And how this body has become sacred because of that. To think that on these flesh and bones, God himself has branded the fact that I can house the very living God. Christ in me. That's what David Livingstone, the last words he etched on a rock, Christ in me. David Livingstone, Christ in you as a believer. Jesus gave us the reality of human nature, the spirituality of genuine worship. Thirdly, the purity of his own person. I heard my brother Michael talking about that. The purity. Which of you convinces me of sin? I find no fault in this man. But what I think I want to draw here is very significant. I know the last time I was here, I gave you that beautiful thought, which is like a treasured nugget in my own life now. Remember what I mentioned to you, how the pursuit of the Hebrews was light? The Lord is my light and my salvation, and the pursuit of the Greeks is knowledge, and the pursuit of the Romans was glory. The Hebrews pursued light, Greeks knowledge, and Romans glory. And I said how the Apostle Paul said God has caused his light to shine in our hearts to give to us the light and the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus. Remember how in the convergence of the person of Christ, light, knowledge, and glory converge? Let me stretch that point a little more. Please follow now. Anything you create at best will be somewhat different from you. Anything you create at best will be somewhat different from you. It may be similar, but never be essentially the same. So an artist can do a self-portrait, a sculptor can do a self-portrait on stone, and you can create all kinds of pieces of music, of works of art, and so on. It may be a similarity to you, but it will be different to you. Only that which is begotten is identical to the begetter. And Jesus Christ is the begotten of the Father. I and the Father are one. And in that Garden of Gethsemane, this one who is begotten of the Father, impeccable and spotless, prays, and in his praise he refers to God as his Holy Father. As his Holy Father. Now here's the dramatic truth in Christian faith. When the Holy Spirit works within our heart, that internal touch, we become begotten of the Spirit. And when we are begotten of the Spirit, and the Christ comes and lives within us, we can lay claim, because of his purity, his work, and his regeneration, we too can turn to God and call him Holy Father. So the purity of Christ is not merely an abstract dogma. That purity which is so marvelous that light, knowledge, and glory converges. There is no religious teacher in history. I repeat that. There is no prophet in history. There is no apostle in history. None of them can ever affirm what Jesus did. Even, in fact, the Quran refers to him as born of the Virgin without any fault. Softening word, but there is that sinlessness about our Lord, and then that begetting work in his purity. So we see the reality of human nature, the spirituality of genuine worship, the purity of his own person. Fourthly and quickly, the unity he gives in life's diversity. The unity in life's diversity. Do you realize that the greatest pursuit of the philosophers has been to find unity in diversity? To find unity in diversity. Socrates tried it, Plato tried it, Aristotle tried it. Aristotle's best-known student was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great tried to take Aristotelian philosophy and unify the world in Greek language and Greek thought. Unity in diversity has been a historical pursuit. In fact, the very word university means trying to find unity in diversity. In the American coins, you have these words, e pluribus unum, which means out of the many, one, the melting pot, but finding unity. The very word quintessence, which literally means the fifth essence, comes from the Greek philosophers, when you think back, that they said there were four essences: earth, air, water, fire. Somebody said, what is the fifth essence that unites these four essences? What is the quintessence of life? So whether it's a pluribus unum, university, unity in diversity, or whatever it is, do you realize, in order to explain diversity in the unity and diversity in the effect, I am more and more convinced there would have to be unity and diversity in the first cause, and only in the Christian dogma is there unity and diversity in the doctrine of the Trinity in the first cause. You see, the unity and diversity within the doctrine of the Trinity and the community that is established, distinction, yet identity and purpose of being one in all of that. How does this work out in life? The unity and diversity doctrine coalesces my own life. It coalesces my own life in the worship of Christ, whom I can worship in spirit, internally, and in truth within boundaries that he's established. Archbishop William Temple defined worship in these words: He said, worship is the submission of all of my nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. Quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. The coalescing of all of my faculties in the unity of worship. Do you remember the film Chariots of Fire? How the Scottish runner Eric Liddell is charged or challenged by his sister in that film. She says, Eric, you're giving up so much in order to win this gold medal. And he says to her, Jenny, God has made me for a purpose, for China, but He's also made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure. You see, not only his missionary activity was an expression of his worship of God, so was his running on the track and field. And when his gold medal was over with, it was over with, he'd won it, he was gone, on to a missionary in China. And he lived his life of worship, which was coextensive with all that he did. So we worship not only when we take the Lord's Supper, we worship even if we are out in a tennis court, taking the exercise that the body needs as an expression of my gratitude to God. Worship is the unity in diversity. So we've got here in Jesus the reality of human nature, the spirituality of genuine worship, the purity of His own person, the unity in life's diversity, and lastly, the continuity of life beyond the grave. The continuity of life beyond the grave. It is interesting to read in the Quranic writings where they describe that Jesus did raise people from the dead. That is found in the Quran. It's very interesting that He did raise people from the dead. Of course, today our entire Christian doctrine hangs on that peg. And Paul said, if Christ be not raised from the dead, then our faith is all in vain. But put yourself in the place of the disciples who all of a sudden lost it when they saw Him on 2 pieces of timber dying such a shameful death. And then His body is taken and tucked away. They were hiding like a bunch of frightened Boy Scouts, not knowing what to do with their tomorrow themselves. And as they pondered that, in the marvelous breaking of the chains of death, as Jesus emerged alive, as He prophesied He would destroy this temple, He said, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And you go back right to the Old Testament, you see the prognostication of His resurrection. You see it in the New Testament, too, very different to some of these mythic legends that people espouse, some remote mystery religion somewhere. But here it is, He said death would not be able to hold Him. He was going to go back to be in glory with His Father, prepare a place so that we could go. And that dogma of the resurrection fuses life with such hope and such guarantee, because our home is not just here for now, but our home is ultimately in a realm with God Himself. Have you ever pondered on this one idea? What would you do to frighten Lazarus after he'd been raised from the dead? Is there anything you could do to say to him, I'm going to scare you, Lazarus, i.e., I'm going to kill you? There is a well-known play by Eugene O'Neill entitled Lazarus Laughed, because Caligula is going around killing the Christians, and everybody is getting scared until he bumps into Lazarus, and he says, Lazarus, I'm going to kill you if you're a Christian. Lazarus goes, ha ha ha. And the argument goes back and forth, and finally says, Lazarus, one more ha 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 out of you, and you're going to be a dead man. And Lazarus bends over in uncontrollable laughter, now comes up for air and says, haven't you heard, Caligula? Death is dead. Death is dead. How do you frighten somebody who's already been there and knows the one who's going to let him out, not going to let you out? G.K. Chesterton wrote it so beautifully. In the words, he put words into Lazarus' bound body coming out of the tomb. He says this, after one moment when I bowed my head, and the whole world turned over and came upright, I walked again where the old road shone white, and heard what men said. The sages have 100 maps to give that trace their crawling cosmos like a tree. They rattle reason out through many a sieve that stores the dust and lets the gold go free. And all these things are less than dust to me, for my name is Lazarus, and I live. All these things are less than dust to me, for my name is Lazarus, and I live. Billy Graham said once, he was in the offices of Konrad Adenauer, the mayor of Cologne and the chancellor of Germany succeeding Hitler, and Adenauer asked for Billy Graham to come and visit him. And he looked at the young evangelist eyeball to eyeball, asked him a lot of questions. And then he went over to the window looking across the ruins of his city. And he says, Mr. Graham, I want to ask you a question. He said, do you really believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Do you really believe in the resurrection of the dead, those who are in Christ? And as he looked over the debris of his befallen city, Billy Graham, the nervous young evangelist, said, Mr. Adenauer, if I didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead from the dead because of Christ, I would not be preaching the gospel. And Adenauer continued to look outside, and this great 20th century statesman said this to the young evangelist. He said, Mr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. Outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. I promised to read you these words earlier on. Let me end with this, and then I'll be through. Believe me, I've clipped a lot, but you're grateful for that too. G.K. Chesterton ends his classic book, Orthodoxy, with these words, because I think of the joy that awaits us when we see him face to face, our Lord in all of his purity and his splendor. And in his high priestly prayer, he prayed that we would be with him so that we could see him in his glory. I think of Peter, James, and John at the top of the mountain, so stunned by the transfiguration. What is heaven going to be like? Because was it not Don Wurtson, the songwriter, who said, when engulfed by the terror of tempestuous seas, unknown waves beside you before you roll, at the end of trials and so on is your destiny, and when fear and conflict seizes your soul, he said, but just think of stepping on shore and finding it heaven, of touching a hand and finding it God's, of breathing new air and finding it celestial, of waking up in glory and finding it home. That's the destiny, the bliss. Here is a marvelous way in which Chesterton ends his book, Orthodoxy. I love this stanza. I wish I could quote it verbatim, but I'd lose some of the beauty he has here. Joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. Listen to that again. Joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. You see, because for the pagan, only the peripheral questions are answered. The fundamental ones are not. Therefore, joy is peripheral for him, and sorrow is fundamental. For the Christian, joy is fundamental and sorrow is peripheral. So joy, which was the small publicity of the pagan, is the gigantic secret of the Christian. And as I close this chaotic volume, I open again the strange small book from which all Christianity came. And I'm again haunted by a kind of confirmation. This tremendous figure of Jesus which fills the Gospels towers in this respect as in every other above all the thinkers who ever thought themselves tall. His pathos was natural, almost casual. The Stoics, ancient and modern, were proud of concealing their tears. He never concealed his tears. He showed them plainly on his face at any daily sight, such as the far sight of his native city. Yet he did conceal something. Solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists are proud of restraining their anger. He never restrained his anger. He flung furniture down the front steps of the temple and asked men how they expected to escape the damnation of hell. Yet he restrained something. I say it with reverence. There was in that shattering personality a thread that must be called shyness. There was something that he hid from all men when he went up to a mountain to pray. There was something that he covered constantly by abrupt silence or impetuous isolation. There was some one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked upon our earth, and I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth. I have sometimes fancied that it was his mirth, his joy, his laughter. And I say to you, that is the glory that John saw in the Revelation, and the beauty of what was going on. No longer everyone fell down and said, holy, holy, holy. This Christ, who understood the reality of human nature, through his purity, bringing unity and diversity, ultimately has the continuity in our lives to take us to our very heavenly dwelling. There is no one in history like our blessed Lord Jesus, and that is the truth as he is unique amongst the religions of the world. May God bless you.